everyone. I want to give a special prize to everyone in the room right now and not out just getting coffee while we have this great conversation on America. For those of you who don't know, I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of the National Interest. We have a great panel, but I have to tell you something first. I had a dream about this panel last night. When you think about shifting hegemony, I said, you know, what would be cool is if we had our cluster of people here on the American side facing a cluster of the China panel, which comes up in a couple hours, and we played ping pong, you know, back and forth, kind of looking at this shifting hegemony thing. And then after listening to the first panel this morning, I began thinking as my jet lag was setting in, you know, maybe we could, you know, basically operate foreign policy by generative AI and replace foreign ministers with AI agents. So that may be what comes up next. So I don't know where this conversation will go, but our job here is to look at really the state of American foreign policy and the state of the liberal global order. And we've got a great panel here to do that. Just to my left, we have Ambassador Doug Silliman, who's president and CEO of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. I should say Douglas Silliman, but I'm going to say Doug. And we have Paul Saunders, who is president of the Center for the National Interest and also a board member of that center. We have Professor Eric Hamilton, who is associate vice chancellor and chief of staff and a lecturer. He's got all these jobs. I hope he gets separate paychecks for all of them. Lecturer of political science at NYU Abu Dhabi. So let me just start here for a minute and ask Eric. I have been thinking a lot, not just about my China-US idea here, which would be kind of cool, but really whether this question, how solvent the question is in this following sense. That if you look at the last 75, 80 years in which the United States, after the Second World War, set up a system of institutions and norms and a kind of global social contract, whether that was a selfless act or a selfish act, was setting up the liberal order that we now see a lot of people lamenting in this moment, where you see real challenges from the Trump administration, you see an American mercantilism and transactionalism, you see America First policies that are coming up. Part of my question is, have we not always underneath it all really had an America First policy? Was it more mercantile metaphorically than people think? Or is this really truly a transition to something different, where the system America set up before, it was king of that hill, and now it's kicking down that hill? So I'd like to know about this balance between self-interest and selflessness, because I think it's really important to get that, you know, figured out if we're going to have a true discussion about what the consequences of changing the liberal order are.
Thanks, Steve. I think the answer, unfortunately, is both, in the sense that...
You're one of those kind of people?
Well, you know, there are different sides to this story, but of course, I think the U.S. Has always had an interest-based foreign policy at heart. And after World War II, there was an explicit effort to design relationships, security relationships, economic relationships, and to project U.S. power in a way that enabled an economic system to flourish that the U.S. benefited from. The establishment of the U.S. dollar as a global and world currency that really underwrote the U.S. system obviously had financial benefits to the U.S. Now, why I say both is because there were also selfless acts involved as well. I think some of the soft diplomacy, for example, that the U.S. has always engaged in, I come from a university. I think universities are sources of both outreach to the world and also bring people into the United States, teach them about American culture, and help.
We don't do that anymore, by the way.
Well, we can talk about some of the changes, I think. But there have always been elements of U.S. Foreign aid and the relationship, I think, that have had elements of selflessness as well. Now, with the end of the Cold War, I think one of the things that changed about the U.S. order was more of an emphasis on the export of the economic model and democracy promotion. And I think if you look back into the earlier post-war history, what you see is a willingness to engage with different types of political regimes very openly and easily. And I think there's a return to some of that right now. So some of this is not a remaking of the world order and the US approach to it, but very much a return to some of those earlier elements, I would say.
Just real quick before I jump to Doug, I want to, when you talk about democracy promotion, I remember, I've been at this conference every year. I remember you go back to the beginning of the Abu Dhabi strategic debate, and democracy promotion over here felt like democracy imposition, that it was done at the point of a bayonet and a gun, and saw a very forceful kind of American rollback that many people think has led to this sort of set of consequences that have led to a perceived decline of the United States, which we're going to get into in a moment, on whether there really is a decline or maybe Trumpism is solving a lot of problems to come in. But just real quick on that, when we talk about democracy, I just want to know how introspective America should be as it sees this shift going on and how culpable it is for this shift in hegemonic status.
Culpable in the sense of sort of the
like
stepping
it shot
back
itself
from
in the foot by invading Iraq, setting things in motion and cloaking them in democracy promotion and liberalism.
So
I'm talking about the cloak of liberalism, right?
Yeah.
Which
So in her opening remarks, Dr. Ebtisam mentioned that there's not a region in the world or an issue where people aren't interested in the US perspective. And I think if American foreign policymakers are to be introspective, it's to remember that when the US moves, it is a mountain moving and people are responding to that. And so when the US adopts a policy of democracy promotion, it's really important to understand how that is perceived elsewhere in the world. And so I think, yes, and to some extent, we've created some of these conditions ourselves. And this is a sort of retrenchment from that, if you will.
So Ambassador Silliman, part of the reality of the American liberal order, the global liberal order, is a sprawling network of American bases, military capacity, intelligence capacity, that sits under this. And I remember reading a painfully long article by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. It just went on forever, interviewing then President Obama. It was called the Obama Doctrine. And the bottom line of that article was that America had a lot of sprawl in the world, but didn't really quite know what to do with it anymore, that it was often hijacked by other players in ways that America wasn't even conscious of. And Obama said, this system is going to come undone. Essentially, it's under stress and pressure. So I want to put that on the table because that is the world that Donald Trump walked into. So if you look at what the conditions were, there was an awful lot of inertia built into American foreign policy, American defense and security policy. And so I just want to ask you, as you sort of look at the way that Donald Trump has come into the scene and gut-punched a lot of that inertia, created this scramble and this set of things, aren't there a lot of good things that Make America Great Again is doing?
I think that what President Trump has been able to do in this term that he didn't do in the first term is define more clearly what he sees as American interest overseas. He's done that mostly drawing on American domestic politics, and we should probably get into that piece at some point of this conversation. But I also want to start, as we were building this sprawling network of security and intelligence organizations, we were also building a sprawling network of NGOs, women's rights, LGBTQ rights organizations, and frankly, just a long period of economic development assistance that started in the 1960s with very simple agricultural development programs, the goal of which was actually to do good, to make the condition of life for more people in the world better. It was done in such a way that also tied people economically to the United States in the system that you talked about. So I think that you're right. This was both good and bad. This was both something meant to do good in the world and something meant to perpetuate the strength that the United States had coming out of World War II and then coming out of the end of the Cold War. So I think that Barack Obama wanted to remake the way that U.S. foreign policy and foreign security policy changed and wanted more help. I specifically remember when he came to Turkey, where I was the number 2 in the embassy in 2009. Part of the messaging was the United States no longer wants to be the world's sole policeman. The United States wants to work with our closest friends and allies around the world to decide together what are the most important issues we need to address, and then find more communal ways to address that. I don't know that he was successful in that.
Because do you believe that Obama really wanted that? That the United States really wanted a consensus-driven decision-making machine on security? I mean, one of the big things I've always thought about, with all due respect to our friends in Europe, who now feel so guilty, you know, as they say, well, now we're finally upping our defense expenditures and we're gutting up. But you know, the Europe we had before, which wasn't spending that, was the Europe America wanted. Let's just have no doubt about that. A weaker Europe that couldn't make its own decisions or couldn't move on was what the United States wanted. That seems to have changed, right?
But I think President Obama wanted a more collective decision-making. He knew at its core that it would rely on American opinions and American power in many areas where power needed to be exercised. And I think that he fell off of that idea over time when it was not particularly an effective strategy. But I think theoretically, morally, politically, at the beginning of his administration, this was one of the major points that we as practitioners overseas were being asked to talk to our friends and allies. And I was serving in a NATO ally, Turkey, at that point. And there was a lot of conversation about how can the United States not withdraw from decision-making, but make sure that the decisions that we take are taken within the context of consultation with our allies.
Paul, you run the Center for the National Interest, and one of the great debates about U.S. foreign policy that's gone on for generations, which Henry Kissinger used to always talk about, was the battle between sort of Wilsonian idealism and sort of Nixonian realism. And you know, I guess my question to you is Donald Trump reflecting the kind of crack cocaine version of Nixonian realism? And you're getting this hardcore, very, very specific, a kind of new refresh in realism that's just putting a lot of the other junk away, which is a combination of engagement in the world and a combination of disinterest in significant parts of the world. How do you see it?
Look, I think that President Trump clearly is trying to return to realism in managing American foreign policy, and I think that's basically.
Do you think he knows he's doing that?
Oh, I'm not sure that the president is really deeply into IR theory. But I think that the president.
But his gut is hardcore.
Is kind of in his gut, focused on American interests, and I think that's what he gives priority to. Let me also say, and here I'll echo Eric, who I think made a very good point. You know, when the United States originally formulated its foreign policy strategy after the end of World War II, that was a strategy in NSC 68, you know, for the document geeks. NSC 68 was the U.S. government that was the U.S. government document that was the foundation for American strategy at that time. It explicitly stated that the United States had no need to bring other governments into conformity with America's own approach, and actually argued that really only America's rivals and principal rival at the time needed to do that. So I think in many respects we are seeing a return to that kind of 1950s era approach to American foreign policy, and there's more continuity than might be immediately obvious because the president's style is so different.
Well, how is that? You know, in the 50s you had Dean Acheson, you had institution builders. Today you've got institution wreckers, right?
Well,
you have East Wing wreckers.
I would look at it slightly differently. I take your point. I'm
actually not being facetious. I mean, I think part of it is you may be right, 50s. I mean, but I would put it earlier. If you're going to rewrite and redo these institutions, who do you see in Trump land are the institution rewirers or the rebuilders or the architects? of things other than big ballrooms?
Let's look at it slightly differently. I think the United States was able to play the leading role that it played in the 1940s and 1950s because almost every other nation that had participated significantly in the war had been devastated, and almost every nation that didn't participate significantly in the war was emerging from a colonial period, and in many cases quite poor. And I think the United States, through its policy, which I think was deliberate policy and was largely, but not entirely, successful policy, tried to facilitate a stable world order in which others could thrive. And a lot of others did thrive, not everyone did, but some did very well, some did extremely well. And now we live in a different world in which that occurred. And I think it is very natural, first of all, that the United States might not be able to or want to continue to do things that it was doing earlier. And I think it's also very understandable that others might not want the United States to do everything that it was doing earlier. It's certainly true that others can afford to do a lot more than they were doing earlier, and that's how I would look at what's happening.
Eric, what Paul is describing is ancient Rome. That was the center of things, but Rome in its empire became less and less relevant to its empire. It actually kind of fell apart and walked away from its own empire, but all this stuff. So is the new Constantinople Beijing?
Well, they were part of the same empire, so it's a little different.
What's that?
They were part of the same empire, so it's a little different.
No, but you see what I'm saying, is that what Paul's describing is, the United States in this moment may be ambivalent about the world it created, could walk away from it, could be engaged in it, could not be engaged in it. And we're talking a lot about, there's kind of narcissism built into this conversation. India's got its plans, China's got its plans. If you listen to people like John Eikenberry, they all benefited from the system of rules and norms and the global order and trade that we created. And now the United States is walking away from it. They may still enjoy it. So metaphorically, isn't the capital potentially of the global liberal order just moving out of America to other places?
Yeah, so it's certainly diffusing. I think the rise of China and the rise of the rest is a sort of undeniable force over the last few decades. But I think there's something else going on. It's not just ambivalence. It's a desire for security on the cheap in some sense. We're talking about, I think, short-term changes in U.S. policy under the Trump administration, but there are longer-run changes that have been happening over the last decade plus that I think Trump is the direct and most radical manifestation of some of those things. But if you look back at 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, that happened under the Obama administration. I think there was a sense that the Trump administration enacted a change in U.S. foreign economic policy toward China, and that maybe that was temporary, but then the Biden administration very much kept along the same policy lines. And so there are deeper shifts in U.S. policy, I think, that we're seeing right now. And partly this is because the U.S., if you look in the region in terms of military bases, in terms of economic activity, in terms of diplomatic activity, the U.S. is still very much a hegemon in this region, but the question of whether there's a willingness of the U.S. to leverage those things and do things for right or wrong, such as the Iraq War, I think we're in a different world right now. And I think that the U.S. is ambivalent on this point, which is how much blood and treasure it's willing to spend in order to enact its foreign policy.
Doug?
Because I don't think that President Trump is as concerned about the balance of power in the old geostrategic post-World War II or even post-Cold War terms. He sees power now as a network of businesses, the ability to provide prosperity, jobs, money to the United States, And I think his main goal is not necessarily to perpetuate American bases overseas, but to make sure that Americans, American companies, can see profitability, can see some benefit from US economic policies. I also think that on the traditional things, some of what the president has done is a bit more performative. The style of US international affairs has changed. I don't think the basic underlying interests have significantly changed. And President Trump has changed in American domestic politics the old adage that foreign policy ends at the water's edge, that you have to support the sitting president's foreign policy when you go overseas. That has fallen apart over the past 20 years. And he's gone one step beyond that to ask that everyone support his personal foreign policy. And he has personalized the conduct of foreign policy in his own relationships with world leaders or working through trusted, personally well-known special envoys, of which you see 2 or 3 prominent ones here in this region. I don't think they're working on anything that's much different than what we've talked about already. It's just that the way that he approaches this and the centralization of control in the White House and in the Oval Office has become much more important.
So is what you're describing the punctuation point of the death of the liberal order?
I don't think so, because
Really?
I don't think so. I think what he is trying to do is, for his own administration, figure out how he wants things to be run. But
So what's liberal about that in the, the L sense?
it is not necessarily liberal within an American political system. It does not destroy the liberal
But you do see the
world order.
contradiction.
Oh, American foreign policy has always been full of contradictions, and so much of American foreign policy is based in American domestic policy and what presidents need to increase their approval ratings or get reelected or get congressmen and senators from their parties elected in the next elections. That is still part of American politics. The question is going to be, is the liberal order on a global scale, if it is practiced by governments that have a bit more central control, but the benefits are expanded, does that change the liberal order or just the performance and the way that it is made?
Paul?
Well, look, I think much of what we have seen happening over the last 20, 25 years in the United States is a series of American leaders, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, who defined American international leadership in ways that the American public didn't fully support and didn't fully like. And particularly in the case, I think, of President Clinton and President Bush, they justified and defended decisions that they took on the basis of preserving, maintaining, sustaining, strengthening American leadership. And I think Americans looked at a lot of those policies and didn't like the policies, and at least some of them decided that they didn't really like the leadership that much either, as a result of how Bush and Clinton in particular were invoking leadership in justifying America's role in the world politically. President Trump, I think, very smartly saw a big political opportunity there and gave the last push to a consensus that was already mostly broken. What he hasn't done yet is to build a new consensus in the United States around a clear vision for America's role in the world, and that's still contested between Republicans and Democrats. It's contested among Republicans. It's contested among Democrats also. And I think that's the process we're going through in the United States. I think it's far too early to make strong assumptions about what the outcome of that process will be. I think we could see something at the end very different. How do you think the rest of the world,
Paul, is receiving this moment? You know, we've got a lot of countries represented in this room. And I have to say that you're going to walk around the Middle East and Middle East leaders, and I talked to a bunch of them. They always say, God, they love how clear President Trump is, and they love him way, way more than they love Joe Biden, I mean, by far. They say, he stands where he says what he means, he does what he says, and they like the transactionalism. But if they're honest and you scratch beneath the surface, with respect to my friends from China in the room, all of them are hedging their bets with China or hedging their bets with other places. So there is kind of a duplicity, a friendly duplicity involved where they're less in one camp than ever before. And so the question I have as we kind of look at this moment, of this moment of transition and whether or not the liberal order still exists in different form, in different practices, whether America has actually set itself up for further decline, because fundamentally, a lot of people like the enthusiasm of Trump, the transactionalism of Trump, but they don't actually trust Trump. Chris? Eric?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So you asked, is sort of this point the death knell of the liberal order? And I think orders survive administrations, I hope. But I think what happened in the first Trump administration, and is a continuation now on crack, as you mentioned, is that it's sown the seeds for dissolution. So there was a trust built into the system, right? Obviously, countries are always transactional in some sense, but there was a trust. If you are a country buying weapon systems from the US, if you're building an AI campus, you're making decisions about the relationship with the US that are 20, 30, 40 years in duration, because you're going to be servicing those systems and you're going to be investing in them over the long run. And I think the thing that I'm most worried about is that US foreign policy, having lived outside of the country now for 12 years and always talking to people who are not Americans, is that it's erratic. It's uncertain, it's untrustable, and it feels like things could shift in a way that they couldn't shift in the past. And so this notion of hedging your bets, finding alternative partners, finding independent solutions on your own, it's hard, but I think the costs of doing that, of not doing that right now, are so much greater, and it's pushing states in that direction.
Right?
I think that you're seeing institutions that came out of the international liberal order being seriously challenged. I mean, 2 blocks from where my office is in Washington, you've got the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund, both of which are under great pressure to figure out a new role for themselves going into the future. Private sector development of less developed countries is going to be what happens going forward. If you are going to, I mean, you see this even in the statements of Ahmed Ashara and the members of the new Syrian government. They're not saying we want billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia or from Abu Dhabi. We want private sector development. We want Turkish companies, we want Saudi companies, American companies, European companies to come help us rebuild the new Syria. I think that the idea of an international order, even including the United Nations, and its ability to help countries that feel that they need to be lifted up to a higher position is not going to be as prominent as it was in the past. So I think not necessarily that the United States is not going to participate in a newly defined liberal world order, but international institutions will probably be less important, and large international corporations and deals that exchange finance for products and finance for development is likely to be the model going forward.
You know, one of the things that I really appreciate about President Trump is the clarity about some of the international institutions that he feels are not delivering. And I think there are a lot of players around the world who think the United Nations was not delivering. It was unreformed, that you had a permanent 5 that made no sense given the way power is today. And I would just ask, again, to kind of look at this, this tension in the system. Isn't this a possibly good thing? I realize I'm arguing both sides of the argument here, but to some degree, we have institutions that are not in line with the way power works in the world, and that system was just decaying. I thought Barack Obama had a decent chance of rewriting the global social contract, getting Brazil and India and other places, pushing reset with Iran in a constructive way, hopefully doing some of these things that might send a new message to the world. All of that went down into the gutter and went nowhere. And so in my mind, Donald Trump was a national market reaction to the impotence of leadership. And so I guess my question to you is, shouldn't we be more aggressively now moving to rewire these institutions that you're just holding up?
I'm not sure that these institutions can be consciously rewired. I think it's going to have to develop over time. My concern about the development of the new system, particularly of financing development in the world, is that the money will go where the money can make a profit.
Right.
And in another part of my life, I sit on an advisory board for an international energy group that is very concerned that for less developed Asia, for most of sub-Saharan Africa, even parts of Latin America, there is not enough capital available, as now the big finance companies, the big venture capital chases artificial intelligence, compute, data centers, not only in the United States and Europe, but around the world. And unless Africa can get into that game, unless less developed Southeast Asia can get into that game, they again will be left behind because they don't have a compelling geopolitical reason or a compelling economic reason. So again, I don't think that the international institutions are going to go away, but they're going to have to evolve to provide different ideas and different kind of leadership for countries that need more international help and cannot get the BlackRocks of the world to finance their development.
So Paul and Eric, one of the other, I think, big things that's still out there that kind of clunks around in this metaphor about power, China, my friends in China over here, they weren't supposed to succeed, right? You weren't supposed to be able to succeed with a command economy and the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. It was supposed to be built with so many internal contradictions, it wasn't supposed to succeed. It turns out their model of economic development, we had a lot of hubris inside the United States, I would argue inside Europe, about Chinese economic development being something that was a copycat, place. China's been incredible with what it has brought to the table, what it has achieved, the number of people that it's lifted out of poverty, and the engine that they've created. But illiberal capitalism was not supposed to work. And so I guess my question is, as we sort of talk about the liberal order, which also implies we're sort of talking about democracies and systems, is that just a feel-good thing for the West now? Are we delivering on what democracy is supposed to deliver and mean? Or do we have a much deeper ideological tension where nations around the world are saying, it's not just the rise of populism, it's the rise of a different kind of decision-making, a different kind of authority, different kind of industrial policy that's the much bigger part of the DNA of the future, because China has succeeded so magnificently. So is the democratic story as well as the liberal story fading away?
Well, first of all, I think China has succeeded in a very impressive way, and one of the things that has been...
You're saying that really enthusiastically.
Well, I think it's true, and one of the things that I've been kind of most intrigued by is sort of the competition among companies supported by different provincial governments, and the way that sort of creates in a different way some of the competitive pressures that exist in the United States through our market system. It has its own downsides. It has its own limitations. I'm not saying that our system is flawless. I don't think any system ultimately is flawless. And look, as a longer-term matter, every human system works until it doesn't, right? And I think it's a little bit
we could put that on a bumper sticker.
I think it's true. It's an illusion to think that you will sort of always be able to see kind of a slow decline of a system and then it ends. These things are much of the time non-linear. I mean, think stock markets, think revolutions or other kinds of change. These things are often nonlinear. But let me go back, Steve, actually, my last point here, an event you may remember because I think you were there, when Richard Nixon created the Center for the National Interest in 1994.
I was definitely there.
Yeah. He gave a speech, and during his speech, he said that freedom was on trial. He said freedom is on trial. He was, at that time, talking about the former Soviet Union, and he was trying to urge the then Clinton administration, really, to step in and to help Russia and other countries so that they would be able to deliver for their citizens and demonstrate that democracy could work. And that kind of worked in some cases better than in others. What I think our leaders in the United States and in some other Western countries really forgot about their own systems is that democracy is a means, not an end. And if you read the first 6 words of the preamble to the United States Constitution, which say, "We the people, comma, in order to," that makes clear that the purpose of the United States Constitution and the United States government is to deliver the benefits that are described in the rest of that paragraph. And I think our leaders became sort of far too obsessed with democracy as an end, as opposed to democracy as a means to achieve all of these things for society. And I think in the United States and some other countries, we're paying a price for that now. I happen to think it's a very resilient system, and that we'll get through that. Interesting.
Guess they want you to be a little shorter.
Right. I'm sorry.
Comments.
Well, I can finish on that point. I think that's something that we need to remember here, and this is when you're talking about the competition between these approaches. Ultimately, it comes down to delivering for people.
Go ahead.
Well, and ultimately, I think that many of the things that President Trump is being criticized of doing today, both domestically in the United States and internationally, are going to be adopted by future Democratic administrations and future Republican administrations. More centralized focus on the decisions of the president, more use of executive orders, and perhaps clearer articulation of American interests as is defined by the president in power or the party in power. I also fear that a future Democratic administration is going to spend much of its time undoing through executive order what President Trump is doing through executive order, which may hurt the consistency of American policy and the extent to which that consistent American policy is useful or necessary to expand American interest around the world. That could be a casualty, at least on the margins.
Do you think America is in NATO in 10 years? Wow, he paused.
I mean, I pause. I think America is in NATO in 10 years. I just don't know what NATO is going to mean in 10 years.
Eric?
Is America in NATO in 10 years? Yes.
20 years?
Maybe. I mean, I think there's a lot at stake right now, and I think it comes back to the question of what does the security alliance mean anymore, and what does it do, and what does it require? And you made a point before about, I think we should give credit where credit's due, is that the liberal order works because there was supposed to be some measure of shared burden among partners in those relationships.
Let me ask you all a question here. I ask about the NATO question in 20 years or 10 years because as I've gotten older, 10 years or 20 years are just not very long, right? And that's, that was 2005, 20 years ago. So, and the bottom line is I think many people see a growing ambivalence and reticence of the United States, at least at this moment, in being engaged. It got exhausted in Afghanistan, got exhausted in Iraq. One would argue the Iraq was of its own making, etc. Doing what it was defined as liberal order democracy promotion didn't go well. A lot of Americans sort of saw themselves as distracted beyond this and sort of recalibrated. But when you look at it, one of the reasons I really love this forum is they started talking about technology this morning. They talked about, Ebtisam Mekebi said, to the minister, are we real leaders or are we fake leaders, essentially, if you get right at what she was asking, leadership, what are you doing to add net value to the system? I think one of the interesting questions that should be woven into this is what is technology of the size and scale of AI or quantum do in reordering power? What does it do to allow small powers to leapfrog up? What does it do to the I hate the term global south, but the global south or the developing world equation? Do we see South Koreas that just went from nothing to extraordinary success, or the Chinas of the world begin to change? So I want to throw that in there because that environment that ecosystem of technology, of talent, of technology absorption requires an ecosystem. And what I don't know, I think the rest of the world is going to do it. What I don't know, I think America will make a lot of the technology. I don't know if we're going to be the ones that wire all of that. It's easy for me to see a world in which that great future happens, but America kind of opts out or is the Forrest Gump of the story. What do you think?
Can I tie this back, I think, to what Paul was saying before? I'll try to be a little more enthusiastic about what I've seen when I've been in China, which is...
I've been waiting for you to be enthusiastic.
Yeah, it's...
about something.
I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing, and I think we should recognize that. And what I think the basic point is that both democracy and capitalism require leadership, and I think that's something that we've lost to some extent. When you look at the sectors and the technologies of the future, they require tremendous investments. Now, US capital markets are incredibly deep and have the pockets for that. But I think the role of what we've gotten to is a system of unfettered capitalism, if you will, where the state is no longer seen as a net positive for helping the market do certain things. And these kinds of investments and strategic shifts really require the government not just to fund things, but yes, I think funding is necessary, but to create the conditions of success, to coordinate and convene industry, government entities, and yes, universities. I mean, one of the things that I worry about for the long term, even in terms of technology development, is that, I think Americans don't realize how much imported talent there is in the country on an annual basis. And to maintain that leadership, the government needs to have active policies around immigration to enable that talent to come, people who want to go to university, who want to start businesses, to create opportunities for both foreign capital and domestic capital to come together and create these $100 billion initiative we're talking about. Those things aren't easy, even if you have the money. You've got to coordinate the energy, the infrastructure, the rules and regulations to enable those kinds of projects. And there was a step in that direction with some of the industrial policy under the Biden administration, but it was not, I think, done well, and I think it was not done with the backing of the American people. And so it's about that sort of democratic leadership to convince people that this is the future and these are the kinds of activities that we need to do. And there's some ambivalence about doing that right now.
How do you see, Paul, the definition of American national interest today? I think there was a period of time where American national interest, since you're the Center for National Interest, you had a commission for the national interest, you're raising money now for a future commission on national interest. In case any of you want to contribute, you can have global contributions, right? But I think that the question is important because America used to define itself much more robustly around the security of its allies and the rest of the world as part of its core national interests. Has that fundamentally changed?
Well, I think the United States had a pretty clear definition of its and a pretty consistent definition of its national interests throughout most of the Cold War period. At the end of the Cold War,
so what's that, like oil, nukes?
Well, what are the top four? If you look at American public opinion surveys over the last 40 or 50 years, there are pretty much always four issues that are at the top. The order changes: nuclear weapons, jobs, energy, and terrorism, actually, by the way. And those four things, they kind of, go up and down as events change, but they're pretty consistently the top issues. But anyway, I think the end of the Cold War and the loss of a major constraint on the United States when the Cold War ended, it created an environment in which some people were able to really dramatically expand how we defined our interests. And we've been talking about the democracy promotion and other things during the conversation today. And
but I mean, we have the international courts. We had responsibility to protect. We had Gates Foundation doing good. I mean, we're doing many good things around the world, right?
Sure. But this definition of American interests, which increasingly we've kind of conflated with global common interests, went too far out in front of what was, I think, reasonably sustainable for the American economy and certainly beyond what Americans wanted, particularly in how it was executed. And you talked about Iraq already, which I think was a decisive contributor to that. And the Trump administration has absolutely sharply narrowed its definition of American interests, and I think for some of us, probably to too great an extent. I think we'll see another correction in the future.
Doug, I want you to answer that, but I also want to talk about this region a little bit,
Okay.
as you do, because you know it so well. But so I kind of look at it. I mean, I look at, they're different kind of nations in the world. They're also different kind of people in the world, but different kind of nations. Some nations are like giant mountains. They make their own weather. And other nations are victims of the weather, or they have to surf the weather they're given. I think certain countries, particularly the one we're sitting in right now, have done extraordinarily well, trying to figure out how to navigate the weather, how to surf the waves coming in. Even now begin to make their own weather in certain ways, but it's very different when you're a China or the United States, or I would say now India, perhaps a Brazil down the road. And when you kind of looking at that level, and you could come back to what Paul was just talking about, how does this region navigate this changing terrain?
I think that Dr. Amar Gadagash probably is one of the best officials in the world who can deliver a really good 10-minute policy speech.
I wish his speech had come after our forum.
Yes, so that's essentially the answer. I think the answer is remaining flexible. Try not to tie yourself too closely to one particular pole, which is also probably an outdated term, but try to build a set of networks.
I mean, the first paragraph of his speech was hedge, baby, hedge, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think that is correct, but at the same time, countries are going to have to decide where their interests lie. And if your interest lies in the quick development of artificial intelligence, compute, data centers, you really have to come to the United States now. If this relies on a third party providing military hardware to help you address threats that you see, you're probably going to have to come to the United States for the next decade or two. I think it leaves the United States still in a dominant position, but it is not as relatively dominant as it was at the end of World War II or at the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think the question will be for most countries in the world that are trying to navigate a changing relative importance of different countries is, what is the role that the United States will play in the core issues for the development of your country? Is there a role for China? Is there a role for India? And are those roles different? Are they complementary? And will they create for you political problems in dealing with your other partners? So it's a network of relationships that will create new problems to navigate as it gets rid of perhaps some of the old problems of needing to reply or to rely completely on the United States.
We're going to go to all of you in a moment and begin getting questions and comments. Just make them short so we can have like lightning round back and forth. But I want to kind of finish with this one from me, which is, I'm still really intrigued with this question where on one hand, pre-Trump, I saw inertia just choking to death so much of American foreign policy, American domestic policy. It was just happening and no one wanted to call it out. And so now you have a reset, a scramble, some would say a rising, different model, but the country and America's having to scramble for what it cares about now. But when you kind of apply this to the global liberal order, I'm trying to sort of figure out whether we're going into a period of mush and just chaos and uncertainty, or whether or not there's some crisis that hits the US while it's going through this moment. And we have sort of Suez crisis-like moment where the world no longer, despite Trump's strength, but no longer looks at America as definitive in the world. And that's what happened to Great Britain in the Suez crisis. And that punctuated the rise of China, which would get a premium on its power, even if its overall resources don't justify it. I would argue that was similar to the United States in somehow. But whether or not there's that kind of clarity that comes out of a crisis of confidence in the United States, or we just end up with a muddy, mushy world? Paul?
Oh, look, I mean, Steve, I think that's entirely possible. I certainly hope it doesn't occur. I think it's by far from inevitable. I think the United States
Scale
has
of 1 to 10, how likely?
I don't know, 3 or something. I mean, I think the United States has really amazing capabilities in many respects, economically, technologically, socially, really an energy revolution, I think, underway in the United States that's transforming the country in a lot of exciting ways. So, I think there are some amazing things happening. I don't think that kind of thing is inevitable at all.
So you're a hopeful optimist.
I am.
Which is strange for a guy from the
For
Center
a
for the
realist.
National Interest.
It's very strange for a realist.
Eric.
You mentioned that 10 or 20 years doesn't sound as long to you anymore. I think a lot of this really depends on what happens in 3 years. 3 years is not that far away. So I think we're likely to see some mush between now and then, if you will. And different things could happen, but the optimist case would be either a Republican wins office that brings some coherence to US foreign policy.
Hold it a little closer.
Sorry. Either a Republican wins office and brings some coherence back to US foreign policy, and not just the policy that we see, but the policy-making process and the structures that undergird it. Or a Democrat wins office and does something similarly. So in 4 years, this panel could be discussing something very different depending on what happens in that election. And that's one of the upsides and downsides to the US system, is that there is constant change and there is the possibility for constant renewal. And I think the world has to live with what we see right now for the next few years. But so long as the Constitution holds, in 3 years there will be a different president.
Doug?
I think the chance of mush is probably a 3. That was the number I was going to give it. But what I think is going to be relevant in the future is not necessarily what is happening in the United States, but how do the governments around the world in countries that are middle powers or smaller powers, how do they cope with individually creating these networks? There's going to be a huge expansion of the options that are available to the government in Abu Dhabi or the government in Burundi. How do you make those choices? Are those choices based on the welfare, the future welfare of your population? Is it based on the ability of your elites to expand their elite status and raise more money? Is it the ability to create favors for a particular deal that you want from a country or a series of countries for your defense? And I think these countries are going to have more autonomy of action going forward and more options. Whether or not those will be effective choices that they make will determine how much mush is in the system and how much I see many countries succeeding in making those decisions.
I mean, what you're describing, which I find really interesting, is an inheritance of the global liberal order that they could benefit and perpetuate without much regard from the other bigger powers.
Yes, but the basis on which those decisions are made, whether it is economic benefit, broad economic benefit for population, corrupt interests, inefficiency, is development sustainable, not necessarily in an environmental standpoint, but can they sustain the benefits for their population? These are all the kinds of decisions that maybe they had a lot of help making in the past from the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and great powers. Now I think more of this is going to be on the heads of the leaders of individual countries.
So we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and normally I have a TV screen here telling me who Ebtisam has picked, and it is not on. So Ebtisam, I'm going to give you the first question.
It's not me, it's Dr. Abdelmenam Said.
Which one?
Abdelmenam Said.
Somebody else has the first question?
I am the guy. I am the guy here.
Okay, great. Go for it.
Well, I will go for it. I am surprised that I didn't hear the word middle class in all the presentations that I heard here, because I think that is the key question. Is there many ways to build a middle class and make a country stronger, or you are not capable of doing this? That is the big question for government.
Right.
And I think we heard in the morning one road to this one, a country like the UAE, is making an idea of using technology to create that middle class and create a country with influential position in world politics. Therefore, I will say that is what the United States and other countries to be aware of. China, India have different, completely political systems, yet both succeeded and graduated hundreds of millions of people from poverty into middle class. What you do in politics, sometimes I hear that the liberal order is kind of a new mythology. I mean, you like a mythology to create an order for some time in a civilization. But it is not necessary because it became like a religion.
Right.
And I say, religions, you know, it's like all mythology, works for some times. But actually, human beings become better when you approach culture, history, beliefs, a lot of things that not really always measurable by elections. We might find a way. I am scared by what was said in the morning, you know, but that's
I think it's a really
else.
important observation that you made. It's one of the reasons I brought that up. But do you have I mean, it's a great observation. Do you have a question connected to it?
No, I got scared in the morning because I see the vulnerabilities of the weak in the world system by the new order of the AI is quite terrifying for me. Thank you.
I happen to love AI. I can help you get over the terror. But I just want to comment because I think what you said is so important about systems and competing systems on how to build a middle class, to build technology, to build capacity. There are also history sometimes rhymes. And I've been very interested in how COVID drove, in my view, so many of the behaviors we've seen. I think it's tied into, you know, a lot of the nationalism that came in as people began worrying about where their resources were. I think it, you know, fueled their politics. I think if you go back to the early 1900s after the Spanish flu, same thing happened. So I think it's very important what you said. Yes, right here. The lady right here in the fifth row.
It's in your you'll see.
Oh, next question is from Ebtisam Al
No, it's Ammar Khalaf.
That's what it says. So
It's Ammar Khalaf.
I do not see who that is. Okay, you're going to pick them.
No,
okay,
no,
she's picking them.
Now it's up.
Sure, I'm here speaking
Okay,
to your left. Right
there
behind.
you are. Okay, great. Okay, go ahead.
The scene wasn't clear from the three speakers in terms of what has really changed in this global liberal order. You mentioned inheritance, you mentioned terms of 3 years. Is this going to be a reversible era that we're living in, or is it irreversible, meaning any potential future president, Republican or Democrat, is the way that they treat the world going to be different in terms of the traditional hegemonic outlook to the world, or is this going to be a much more delegated or a much more shared hegemony with other global powers? Thank you.
Doug answered that, but you believe continuity, right?
Two-part answer. I believe continuity, but the number of powerful actors will grow, and therefore decisions made within the world order are going to be difficult, more difficult, and have greater consequences. I actually endorse Dr. Abdelmonem's thinking that development of a middle class is really the key to success for countries, and that would be very similar to my evaluation of whether or not the countries going into this will have been.
Do you want to jump in, Paul?
Well, I just wanted to say very briefly, history only moves forward, okay? And what I mean by that is American foreign policy is not going to return to the past. There may be significant elements of past approaches that get integrated into new approaches, and we might see more of that than we see right now. But the clock is not going to turn back, and I think that the way that Eric sort of addressed it, actually, who's elected after President Trump? That's something that I frankly spend a lot of time thinking about. President Trump has a lot of really great qualities and has done a number of important things. He is not a systematizer. That's not what he's doing. And the person who follows him is likely to be the person who does that.
My answer, just to add a little bit onto that, is the global liberal order, if you want to frame it that way, has been decaying and eroding for a long time, far before President Trump came in to seem to provide an accelerant into some of the inconsistencies that were there. And it was a system that was decaying and needed to be remade. But so that's why when your very important question is on continuity or discontinuity, you know, I think if you continued in that old system, I think it would have continued. Now we don't know where it will go, but you know, so good point. Next person after Sam.
We have Mark Seaver and Ode Bourdain and David Makovsky.
Okay,
Can you
great.
take them all? Then we
Okay, great.
go back
So
to the speaker.
I'm in the back. I'm in the back here.
Okay.
A couple of you have referred to the burden on the American role in the world due to the uncertainty about transitions from one administration to another and the lack of continuity. Watching the shutdown in government, all of the internal crises of the American system, what are the chances that we can develop a return to some kind of bipartisan approach to the world, or is that just something that's over and done with in the United States?
Eric?
Please, Steve, can we take the others?
Oh, take
then
all
we
the
go?
questions together? Okay.
Oda
Okay.
Bourdain.
All right.
Now Oda Bourdain.
So I can't see who it is, so you've got to pick it who it is.
Steve, how could you miss me? Right here.
Ode, okay?
Can you see me?
Yeah.
All right. My question is to the panelists, to you, Steve, and to Paul, regarding the rising middle class. It happened in India, it happened in China. In 1961, President Kennedy helped India develop the MIT of India. And today, India and China has produced human capital that's creating wealth. My question is, the human capital in the region has to be developed, has to become innovative. And I'll just give you one example. NVIDIA, a US chip company, its market value is over $5 trillion. That exceeds all the oil of the GCC.
Okay. Next question is.
David Makovsky.
Okay, we also have to ask this woman here, because can't have all men. Yeah. So, yeah, so we're going to get this lady here who's been trying to jump out of her seat.
Turkomani will be after.
Okay.
Okay. Should I go, Steve, or do you want to wait?
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Is it David Makovsky?
Yeah.
David.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for a great panel. Look, maybe to pick up on Oda's thing about NVIDIA, I mean, I just wanted to, it seems, if you take the UAE as an example, and hearing what His Excellency Dr. Anwar Gargash said this morning, on one hand he talked about the diversifying, and which some might call the hedging, as you called it, hedging on steroids or whatever, but at the same time when it came to national security issues, it seems clear that the UAE, for example, looks at the idea of semiconductor chips as part of the national security, and here the US is telling people you have to choose, you cannot hedge. You're either with us or with China. And so I just wanted to ask the panel about how AI is an anti-hedging category here, where the US is putting it clearly in the national security framework and is forcing countries to make very clear choices about who their strategic partners are. Thank you.
Great.
Okay,
Let's
now
take this.
Reem Turkomani.
Which
Reem
one?
Turkomani.
Good morning.
Yeah.
So I noticed that most of the security threats that the panel focused on are the ones that come from different states. But right now, there's so many security threats that come from other areas, particularly climate change.
Make it short.
Not only climate change in its own is a security threat, but also even violent conflicts are now increasing with climate change. So right now we have an American president not only denying climate change, but also withdrawing from all the multilateral agreements and commitments the US made in the past.
I got to get into a question.
My question is the US missing out by pulling out of this arena
Right.
and allowing countries like China to make headways in green transition and green technologies?
So we have, is America losing out, pulling out of climate? We have binary choices and choosing one side or the other. We have intellectual capital, $5 trillion companies in India, and then the question before was
Foreign policy bipartisanship.
Bipartisanship, will we ever get back? Okay, Paul.
Yes, I think we will get back to foreign policy bipartisanship. It's just going to take a leader who's
You're such a kumbaya guy.
A coalition builder.
Yeah,
It just requires a coalition builder. I think that can happen. On AI and the middle class and everything, I'm sort of fundamentally a technological optimist. I think there are huge possibilities there. I think the U.S. can play a key role regionally here and elsewhere. On the hedging thing, I don't necessarily like the term hedging. I think governments basically don't like to be forced into making choices, and I think it's best for the United States to limit as much as possible doing that. There are national security areas where we have to do it, but
pulling out of the global commons on climate
and pulling out of the climate agreements actually I think is a mistake. Honestly, I'm not sure that the agreements will really achieve very much, which is a separate discussion. But I think for the United States to be there and to participate is quite important, and I'm sorry that the president has a different view.
Yeah, I'm a little more skeptical about a return to a bipartisan approach. I think U.S. politics are so polarized right now that foreign policy is one area where I think there is a possibility for consensus, but with the polarization, it's really hard to see that right now. The rising middle class question, I think all countries around the world right now have a middle class problem. It looks different in different countries, but for those in the room who know China's economy, yes, they've pulled millions out of poverty and really educated a very large society, but the unemployment rate is extremely high, and that's going to be a challenge. The securitization of AI, it's a huge challenge in the sense that it's not just AI, but if you look at the list of critical and emerging technologies, it's really all areas of advanced tech where the US is trying to put up a very high barrier. And the problem with that is countries like China won't. And so US foreign policy has a choice to make. Do they want to protect those technologies, or do they want to extend them and use it as part of diplomacy? And I agree entirely that US leadership in international institutions is important. And even if for symbolic purposes, and the fact that the US pulled out is a problem. And maybe one last bonus response to the first question, which I think is important, about the changing liberal order. We didn't answer the question in this way, but let me try to answer it this way. If the Trump administration's foreign policy was the new permanent US foreign policy in 3 years and 10 years and 20 years, I think what you'd see is an erosion of the liberal order and a kind of club diplomacy, if you will. Elements of the liberal order may remain, but it would become much more transactional, much less durable, and certainly would erode the order that we know today.
Thank you. We're going to take like one extra minute. Go ahead, Doug.
Okay, Mark, on your question about return to bipartisanship, I think you will see with changes of administrations tennis matches that over time will probably decrease in intensity, but there will always be a back and forth in politics. I'm not sure that we'll ever see the politics stops at the water's edge again, at least not in our lifetime. In terms of, the question about developing a middle class, I think the responsibility for developing middle classes will be on the individual governments of each country that has a middle class. And that will put the burden on those countries no longer as much on the United States, China, or international institutions. And Reem, as to your question about climate change and what can be done about it, I think that you're going to see a lot more attention and resources put into climate adaptation. And I think that the United States is going to lose the battle on application of artificial intelligence and new energy technology to China, which is doing a much better job. And I think that the current policy of the administration in the US is a bad one for US interests, not necessarily for global climate change.
I think it's been a wonderful discussion. I'm going to answer these things. The bipartisanship question, great question, is going to require a huge crisis, a huge national crisis. It's not going to happen without that. That there's no interest in, I mean, there is boutique moments of bipartisanship. I see it all the time in Washington, but fundamental, overt, public bipartisanship and national security won't happen without a crisis. On the middle class, Odeh, and these issues, I'll tell you that the biggest thing that is undoing the miracle that we see in the NVIDIAs, the Silicon Valleys, the AI in America, is the choking off of talent coming into the United States. We were the brain drain problem. Now Europe or India or other places in the world are going to be the source of the next miracle, right? So that's going to be a fundamental challenge for us and an opportunity for others. On David's question on hedging, I think Donald Trump, as part of his power scheme, wants the other nations to pick one side or the other to be in that, but he himself is not nearly as hard on China as he's trying to get everyone else to. You talk to any member of Congress who've riled up their constituents and base on China, Donald Trump is much, much softer, actually, and more of a deal maker than people realize. And fourth, on climate change, I regret to say it, great question. We're going to get cooked. We're going to get hotter. We're not going to cooperate. There's not going to be a real, right now you don't have a fundamental consensus any longer. So even if China takes over the technology and we have BYDs all over the world, it doesn't solve the mathematics of climate change. So what a wonderful, wonderful discussion we've had here. Please give a big round of applause to Douglas Silliman, President and CEO of the Arab Gulf States Institute, Paul Saunders, President of the Center for National Interest, and Eric Hamilton, Associate Vice Chancellor, Chief of Staff, and Lecturer of Political Science at NYU Abu Dhabi. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, that was fun.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.